Okay, so this is the last of the presidency lectures that I'm going to have to record for you because of the snow. Now that we've got a handle on the basic powers of the presidency, the three formal hats and the three informal hats, and some of the specific powers associated with them, just as an example, the power to appoint ambassadors is associated with the head of state role. The power to issue executive orders is associated with the chief executive role. The power to veto things is associated with the president's political center of gravity role, as well as his role as the chief executive, and so on and so forth. So now that we're familiar with these roles and the powers and the complexities associated with them, we can talk a little bit about theories about the presidency, ways to try to understand how all of the different parts of the president fit together, how the president's role in the bully pulpit as an agenda setter, as a popular or unpopular figure, as the leader of his party, as the head of state all end up fitting together, which of them is more important, which of them is less important, and so on. First, though, I do want to sort of give you the broad idea of what we've done in this unit, right? So the central idea is that the presidency is a lot like an onion. You have the president, the person, at the center, but the presidency itself is a much bigger item than just the president, the person. The presidency consists of the White House staff, right in that immediate first level of the onion around the president proper. Then there's the executive office of the president as the much broader second level of the onion, groups like the Council of Economic Advisors and the National Security Council, those professionals who are advising the president rather than his personal or political staff. And then outside of that, there's the broader bureaucracy, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the FBI, whose heads the president generally appoints, but whose heads are very independent. So first, you have to think about the president, the person, as the center of an onion, which is the presidency or the executive branch, if that makes sense. We've talked about the different hats, so think about presidents in hats. If you can guess who this president is who's not wearing a hat and why. You won't be able to guess. It's John Quincy Adams, and he's not wearing a hat because he's the only president who ever went back to Congress after he was president. Anyhow, the first thing to think about with regards to the theories of the presidency, and this is just, of course, a political cartoon about how presidents think of the election. The first thing to consider with regards to the presidency is that it is embedded in its context. Presidents have to act, think, and form policy in a certain way in order to pursue election. Presidential staff, the actual White House staff, have to think about political issues, and those political issues always revolve around the important parts of each election. And in modern American presidential elections, there's, of course, sort of this trend where you have many states that tend to go blue or go red, so to speak, and then a few states which are those toss-up states. We talked about the swing state phenomenon and how it influences presidential elections. Well, it doesn't just influence presidential elections, it also influences presidents and their White House staff and their analysis of issues and their interaction with the rest of the political system. They'll pay a lot more attention to the governor of Ohio than they might to, say, the governor of Wyoming, because the governor of Ohio is likely to be very important to their party's chances, to their re-election chances, and so on. This map also ends up affecting the presidency because it affects who ends up running and becoming president. After all, if it weren't for the way the presidential primary process strongly overemphasizes groups like New Hampshire or Florida, we would have very different selections for the presidential nominees. So when you're thinking about the president's roles as executive or commander-in-chief and so on, you have to keep in mind the political context in which the president's decision-making and analysis is always embedded. When we talked a little bit about President Obama's immigration executive order, it was very important to think about that not only, as we mostly talked about it, as an intellectual exercise about what the proper limits of executive power were, but also to embed it in the context of the fact that the president is the head of the Democratic Party, that immigration is a very important issue to the Democratic Party, and that many of the swing states in each election have as one of their key issues immigration. So that's one important element of thinking about the presidency in terms of theory, is reimagining the president not just as an executive, not just as having constitutional powers in the checks and balances system, but also as taking those actions and using those checks and balances and their executive powers within the context of the political system that they're embedded in, which is influencing them. All right, let's see if there we go. It's also important to sort of think about the president's particular powers, and this slide that's here is just to remind you of what the specific formal and informal powers the president has are. A lot of the informal powers that I have listed here are ones that come from the White House staff rather than the Constitution, or from laws. So they do exist, they're legal powers, but they're not ones which come from the Constitution. So the president's constitutional powers are here, and so are the presidency's most important informal powers. Some of them are subject to other limits that I haven't mentioned. So remember that one of the president's formal powers is to negotiate and sign treaties, but when you think about that, you should think in the back of your head that, oh, right, treaties are also subject to two-thirds Senate ratification, and the president often uses executive agreements instead. Or when you see the fact that the president has the power to propose budgets, by the end of the next unit, you'll want to be able to keep in the back of your head the budget process and what that means about presidential power. Despite the fact that this isn't a complete cheat sheet, taking a minute and pausing the YouTube video to look over these and make sure you remember or understand these basic parts of the presidency's list of powers would be a very useful thing for you to do. The second theoretical thing to imagine as the president, and again I have an exception on this slide, if you don't guess it by the end, I'll tell you what it is. If you have to think about the president as embedded in a context of politics, what this slide is about is thinking about the president as embedded in a context of leadership. It's an unusual job in that unlike many other of the institutions of power that we'll talk about, like Congress or the bureaucracy or the judiciary, the center of the onion is one person. Even though there is a White House staff at the next level of the onion, and an executive office, and an entire bureaucracy, ultimately there is one single decision maker at the bottom of it all, which is not the case in any of the other institutions that we've talked about, so that individual person might matter quite a bit. There are endless books and biographies written about how the background of presidents influences their decision-making and their management style, whether some traits, like let's say having been a military general, are essential to good leadership, or whether some traits, like having served as an executive at the state level, are essential to understanding leadership and being an effective president. It is an endless discussion. The thing that I want to bring to your attention are sort of two key aspects of presidential leadership. The first is how presidents choose to organize their onion, how they choose to manage their onion. Some presidents, as I mentioned in the executive discussion, like to have a lot of personal input into a wide variety of the things that go on in the onion. These are often referred to as hub and spoke or micromanagement presidents. It's a particular leadership style. Jimmy Carter, for example, wanted to be able to monitor the implementation of policies that mattered to him, whether they were policies happening on the lowest level of the Commerce Department or the highest level of the State Department, because he felt that those particular policies demanded special presidential attention. On the other hand, you had extremely delegatory presidents like George W. Bush, who were happy to let their staff bring important decisions to them rather than seeking out the decisions that they wanted to make or have consultation on. Neither of these is necessarily a worse style than the other, the wheel and spoke, or the very, very strictly organized chain of command style where you get to the president only if the staff wants to bring you to the president, or your issue to the president. But they are different ways of approaching the office. Presidents also approach the office very differently when you talk about their method of interacting with Congress and their party. Some presidents have an approach to the office which strongly emphasizes working together with Congress, not using the executive authority itself, and instead primarily using your executive authority as a way to bully or work with Congress. Lyndon Johnson is a pretty good example of this. He did use his independent executive powers, especially his commander-in-chief powers, but at the same time, as someone who had been in the Senate for almost 30 years when he became president, not the Senate, I'm sorry, the House and the Senate, for 30 years when he became president, he felt that this was just another way to help control Congress, which he thought of as perhaps the ultimate lever of power. Barack Obama is in many ways the opposite. He's had almost no success in working with Congress after the first 2 years, and has used the tools of the executive office itself much more than he has used the tools of the legislative and party leadership apparatus that he has access to. Again, neither of these is a better style than the other in any real sense, but some presidents end up strongly emphasizing the legislative side of their job, and some don't. The last two I've got here are exceptions, because it's important to think about presidents as crisis leaders, as Lincoln was, and people who weren't president but who emphasized certain qualities, like an understanding of broad issues like commerce and debt and national economics, which are also important, is that what areas of expertise presidents have and how they manage crises are two other elements of presidential leadership. So the two that are most important to understand is how presidents organize their onion and which powers of their presidency, which elements of their presidency they choose to strongly emphasize. But besides those two, you should also keep in the back of your mind the effectiveness of presidents as crisis managers and the need to have a president one of whose main skills is crisis management, and the importance of a broad portfolio in a wide variety of issues, like, for example, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is also interesting, just like Lincoln, because neither of them was afraid to take rather politically difficult or unpopular positions at times. All right, so moving on. So those are so the first two are the presidency as embedded in politics and the presidency as thinking about leadership. We're also going to talk about a couple of other models of the president. The first is the decider, presider, mediator model. This is a question of which leadership style you prefer, not that one is better than the other. Decider presidents are ones who think of their primary role as listening to the advice from different elements of the White House staff or the executive office or the legislature, and then it is their duty to make the final call decision. They put an emphasis on that. They like to have those moments where they take the decision after receiving several options from their staff. That's their model. Presider presidents, on the other hand, prefer to sit back and let their staff talk out an issue until the staff or the executive office of the president or the legislature can come to a deal. Now, this isn't lazy. Oftentimes, presider presidents put a very strong emphasis on choosing the best possible staff, on setting up strategic situations that allow groups to come to conclusions, on presiding effectively. George Washington really did this. He was not a terribly strong decider. He didn't necessarily come down directly on issues after seeing several possible amendments or several possible resolutions. Instead, he sat back and listened to a lot of advice until finally he could help come to a consensus. The final model is president as mediator, where rather than sitting back and letting a discussion happen, the president takes an active role in bringing not multiple ideas to the table, but opposing sides to the table and mediating their views until they can come up with an option somewhere in the middle. A good example of the difference between presider and mediator, because it can be hard to figure out, is a president who brings dozens and dozens of experts on Social Security policy into a room and sits back and says, okay, we're going to have a long discussion about effective ways to solve Social Security, and I'll bring my expertise as president in and use my powers to try and examine these policy issues in different detail. A mediator would bring in opposing legislators from the Republican and Democratic Party and act as the head of the negotiating table, and they're trying to come to a conclusion about what could fit their two political priorities. So that's one theoretical model, presidents as deciders, presiders, or mediators. The next theoretical model I want you to think about is one called the imperial presidency, and this was made famous in the early to mid 20th century by a historian named Arthur Schlesinger, who actually ended up working for JFK. If we hadn't had class time canceled, we would have been reading a fair amount of stuff by Arthur Schlesinger, but alas. The theory of the president as an imperial president, or an imperial presidency, which is where our meme art here comes from, is that as the United States has increased its military power, increased its diplomatic power, entered the Cold War, become the world's only superpower, concentrated a effectively huge amounts of financial power in the military and the federal government, in which the president has an overarching influence as commander-in-chief and executive, the president's ability to make effective decisions without any input from Congress has increased to the point that the presidency is, Arthur Schlesinger put it very dramatically, imperial. President is bedecked in great power and authority and can choose when to use it and how to use it as they please, without much input from the American people or from Congress and so on. This is particularly important because Schlesinger said that the president used to act in an imperial way only in emergencies. You could have brief emergencies or long emergencies, like, say, the Civil War, but the president only had the kind of imperial power that he has today during emergencies. Today, though, Schlesinger said, because of the size of our military, the amount of our worldwide diplomatic and military commitments, our constant state of financial duress in the national government, the president is always in a state of emergency and so is always appropriating much more tremendous power than at previous periods in our history. It's an old theory these days, the imperial president theory. It was first published in the 50s and 60s, but it still seems to hold true in some cases. The opposite idea was brought out in the 70s and 80s by a political scientist named Richard Neustadt. Richard Neustadt actually said that the opposite is true. As there are so many other groups in government who can effectively wield political influence, the generals in the Pentagon, heads of major agencies themselves, like agencies like the FBI or the CIA, the heads of congressional delegations, all of these people wield power that's very independent from the president, even if in some ways they're connected to the president as, say, commander-in-chief to general or member of the executive branch to commerce secretary. The president must instead focus not on acting in an imperial, unilateral way, but instead exercising what he calls shared powers and negotiating and effectively making deals with all of the other independent parts of government. So Neustadt's theory is almost the opposite. It says that the president, though he is at the center of the federal government, is in fact not able to make decisions as a result. Instead, he's extra constrained as a result. All of the layers of the onion are just more people he has to negotiate with and more tools he has to negotiate with. Now, Neustadt doesn't say that the president is powerless. The president has all kinds of bargaining chips to use as a persuader, bargaining chips created by his other powers. But where the imperial presidency model sees the president as acting decisively using their own authority at any time, the persuader president sees a very different president, one who's strongly limited by the willingness of or his ability to negotiate with other power players, not even all government power players, sometimes interest group power players, within the federal government and the political sphere more broadly. Two that are interesting but you don't need to know are the theory of the plebiscitary president and various political cycle theories. The plebiscitary theory of the presidency says that the president is increasingly powerful, but it's not for the reasons that Arthur Schlesinger thought. Arthur Schlesinger thought the president was more powerful today because it relies on war powers and the emergency management powers that the president has. Plebiscitary president theorists, there are a couple of them, tend to think that the centralization of power in the executive during the New Deal, and then after the New Deal during Johnson's Great Society, and then even during the new federalism era when federal money came to dominate policy, you had more and more power within the executive branch itself. Secondly, presidents are individual focuses of elections, and they're the only person who ever faces, in an election, every single voter in the country. Only the president is ever voted on by every single person in the country. Interesting, the framers didn't necessarily intend it to be this way, but that's the way it is today. And so the combination of these factors, an increasingly financially and legislatively powerful executive branch, a president who is the focus of national media and political attention, who has an individual plebiscite, as it's called, an individual mandate in theory from all of the different voters of the country, you end up with something very much like the imperial presidency, but for very different, much more domestic reasons. Some have called the president an elected dictator. Of course, this is, again, a flight of rhetorical fancy, but it's a way to think about it because it puts the emphasis on the election in the plebiscitary president theory. Finally, there are a number of theorists who've looked at political cycles in the presidency. I'll give you some views of these. They're not terribly important, but they're interesting if you're someone who wants to go out and do some more reading about this topic. There's a whole theory that certain presidents align politics. FDR, for example, is considered an aligning president who sets up a presidential dynasty of Democratic presidents who follow his ideas and his policies and use his political coalition to attain office. This same theory says that these are always followed by successor presidents and presidents who preside over the collapse of what the aligning president had created. So just to give an example of this, the aligning president would have been FDR. An effective successor president was either John F. Kennedy or LBJ, depending on how you look at it. And the collapsed president is either LBJ or Nixon or even Carter if you push it far enough. All of them were operating within the same alignment created by FDR, but they saw it continue, change, get furthered, and eventually decay. This same political cycle theory says that some presidents reconstruct before an alignment can happen, and some presidents are preemptive. They come in and sort of show up in the middle of another president's alignment as a premonition, as a preemption of the next possible alignment. In a way, you could see Nixon as a preemptive president, and you could see Eisenhower as a reconstructive president who helped to restructure and reorganize a currently aligned system. So that's an interesting theory, just like plebiscitary president is an interesting theory, but the ones you really need to know are the imperial presidency, the president as persuader, and the president as decider, presider, or moderator. All right. Sorry about that. I forgot there wasn't another slide. So that's the theoretical angle on the presidency. And it's kind of a big series of thoughts. So just for your sort of personal reference, the first thing you need to think about when you're thinking about theory of the presidency is how the presidency interacts with the electoral system, with political coalitions, with the primary system in his role as party leader and political center. The second thing that you need to think about is how the president acts as a leader and as an organizer of his own bureaucracy. The third thing you need to think about is the decider, presider, mediator model. The fourth is the imperial presidency, and the fifth is the persuader presidency. If you have any questions about these, I do have a question document up. And again, sorry to send you lectures on your snow days, but it's the only way we can get ahead of the game before the exam.